Dawn came like a slow breath over the borderlands of eastern Zalingam, spilling gray light across ridges and lowland valleys. The air tasted of wet earth and wood smoke, and the landscape itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching. Small squads of Kanabi moved through that hush with the practiced calm of people who had learned to read silence like a map. Each unit carried its own purpose, its own rhythms. Together they formed a living network that threaded mountains, rivers, and forests into something like strategy. Flank 77 picked its way along a narrow spine of ridge that arced above a valley of paddy fields and scattered hamlets. They moved without chatter, each step deliberate, each pause measured. Their work was to shape movement through the high ground, to hold, to delay, to make the contours of the land work in their favor. They were not a single anger. They were a measured presence, creating friction where the enemy might expect ease. They watched patrols with patient attention, learning their cadence and the small tells that betrayed tiredness or complacency. When the patrols came, Flank 77 was already a part of the ridge, an extension of stone and root. They acted with restraint and timing, their actions designed to misdirect, to slow, to force decisions that favored those who knew the land. Downriver, along the Chindwin's Bend, Iron Ridge kept its own watch. Boats threaded the water like slow, deliberate stitches carrying food, fuel, and the things that allow an occupying force to move. Iron Ridge made every passage costly in time and uncertainty without becoming a story itself. They shadowed riverbanks, read the patterns of currents and fog, and chose moments to intervene that would ripple beyond a single convoy. Their aim was not spectacle but consequence, to turn a steady supply into an erratic one, to force commanders to consider routes they would rather not take. After each action, they vanished into reed and mangrove, leaving the water to remember what had been and the boats to remember who had been missing. High on the northern highlands, Echo 12 lived among cold and stone. Snow sealed footprints quickly, and fog blurred the line between land and sky. They watched passes as if they were guardians of weather itself, learning the way wind carried sound, where the snow compressed into paths and where it swallowed noise whole. Their reports were simple and precise, sent down through channels that trusted brevity. When a column tried to push through, Echo 12's presence made the approach uncertain. Commanders found themselves making choices under imperfect information, and in war uncertainty is its own weapon. When their task was done, they folded their camps into the mountains and left only the faintest whisper of movement on the ridges. Thunderbolt 5 lived along edges, river crossings, forest trails, and the thin way where one nation's worry became another's problem. Rumors of external intervention had reached Kanabi Command, and Thunderbolt 5 moved like a question mark across borderlands, alert for anyone who would try to slip across unnoticed. They were as much guardians of communities as they were watchers of borders. Their interventions were about protection as much as prevention. When strangers attempted to cross into Kuki territory with intentions that did not match the quiet of the villages, Thunderbolt 5 intercepted those attempts not for glory, but to maintain the fragile order that allowed civilians to tend rice, to fetch water, to sleep without the weight of strangers on their doorsteps. Ironclad unit took care of places that mattered for longer than a day. They reinforced small villages perched like beads on ridgelines, kept watch over supply caches that allowed other squads to operate, and prepared fallback positions that were more about survival than heroics. Their task was logistical courage, building resilience where it was needed. They taught villagers how to harden a doorway, how to store grain where it would not be lost, and how to mark a trail without leaving a trail at all. Theirs was not the flash of an ambush, but the slow, patient work of defense that keeps everything else possible. Shadow 9 moved like a rumor. Their work was intelligence, seeing, listening, and vanishing. They observed troop movements, noted supply depots, and traced the faintest lines of infiltration. They were not a show of force. They were the eyes and ears that allowed the others to be brave at the right time. Their reports were distilled into signals carried by Vanguard 21, the squad that served as the web's nervous system. Vanguard 21 handled communications the way a heart handles blood. Steady, reliable, and always aware of how each beat affected the whole body. The squads did not act in isolation. When Flank 77 made a ridge inhospitable, Iron Ridge weighed the river's options. When Echo 12 reported a window in the highlands, Vanguard 21 threaded that information through runners and fires and coded notes to shift the other units accordingly. Thunderbolt 5's patrols closed paths that could have been exploited by outsiders, while Ironclad ensured that villages in the likely path of movement were ready. It was a choreography grounded in mutual trust and a shared sense of purpose. They were not romanticized heroes, but a network of disciplined people who placed collective security above individual recognition. Support came from unexpected hands. Villagers who had lived under pressure for years learned how to sustain the squads in ways that left little footprint. A basket left at a rock with bread wrapped in leaf, a child running a message between trees, a woman pointing to a hidden spring when asked. These acts were small but profound. Supplies were handed through silent systems learned over years. Nobody boasted, and nobody sought reward. That quiet cooperation knitted the squads into the fabric of the land. In return, the squads repaired roofs, helped haul a sick elder to a healer, and shared warmth near village fires. Those reciprocal gestures were as operationally significant as any maneuver. They were the human infrastructure behind every strategic choice. A week in Sogging showed how these elements converged. Flank 77 held a mountain ridge where an important passage cut the valley like a throat. Iron Ridge stepped into the river's rhythm, turning the currents into an uncertain path for convoys. Echo 12 tended the Highland lookout, keeping the cold watch that turned movement into intelligence. Thunderbolt 5 was stationed along likely crossing points, and Ironclad shored up village defenses. Shadow 9 signals moved through Vanguard 21 to coordinate timing and minimize risk. What unfolded over those 7 days was less a series of battles than a cascade of small, decisive acts. A disrupted convoy here, a frustrated attempt to cross there, a village spared from an unwanted occupation elsewhere. The effect accumulated until the occupying force found its options narrowing, its supply lines frayed, and its intelligence clouded. Adaptation was a constant. Rains turned trails into rivers of mud, forcing Flank 77 to improvise and use the land differently than they had planned. Iron Ridge altered its observation points when convoys shifted course under the cover of fog. Echo 12 used the same storms that made travel perilous to conceal their movements. Snow that would otherwise be a burden became a cloak. Thunderbolt 5 listened for changing patterns in the sounds of the border, shifting their stations without waiting for orders. The squads trusted their training but relied more on initiative and the tacit understanding that comes from long time together. They did not wait for permission to act when a moment demanded action. They acted with the restraint of people who understood that timing, not force, often turned the tide. There were moments of ordinary grace among the pressure. Men and women of the squads took time to help mend a child's torn toy, to settle an argument in a market with a quiet firmness, to teach a young recruit how to read the constellations when the moon was kind. Around campfires, they told stories of hills and rivers, of those who had taught them to move silently, of songs that had kept hope alive when food and warmth were scarce. Those stories became part of the squad's identity, and the lullaby of memory and camaraderie was as powerful a tool as any map or radio. Loss was always present, too. Friends and neighbors were taken by illness or by a miscalculated confrontation. The squads marked those losses not with boastful lines but with simple rituals: a folded cloth left at a waypoint, a bowl of rice set at a shrine, a whispered name carried by a runner. These acts bound them to a purpose that was larger than tactical success. They were tied together by duty and by grief, and both held the network steady when pressures mounted. The squad's effectiveness lay not in spectacle, but in precision. Their actions were designed to keep communities intact, to deny the occupying force the certainty it craved, and to make the landscape itself a part of their strategy. Mountains, rivers, and forests ceased to be mere geography and became instruments. Terrain turned to advantage by people who understood scale without searching for grandeur. Each mission, blocking a ridge, interrupting a convoy, denying a pass, intercepting an intruder was a fragment of a larger picture. None of it relied on single acts of heroism, but on consistent, coordinated choices that accumulated into meaningful outcomes. At dusk, when the light thinned and the land allowed small things to be heard, the laugh of a child from a village, the distant murmur of a river, the rustle of leaves, squads settled into their small routines. Supplies were checked, wounds were tended, and messages were composed for the next day. Men and women who had moved through long days of tension took a moment to write a line in a journal, to braid a strand of hair for a child, to hum a tune learned from an elder. These were the fragments of life that sustained them, small acts of care that preserved not only their bodies, but their sense of who they were. The next morning, they would move again. New missions would appear, some born from intelligence, some from chance, some simply required by the flow of events. Flank 77 would rise with the ridge and slip into shadow. Iron Ridge would watch the river like a patient predator, taking action when necessary and fading when the work was done. Echo 12 would keep the Highland Watch. Thunderbolt 5 would patrol the thin line between borders and communities. Ironclad would continue to strengthen villages, and Shadow 9 would listen and report. Vanguard 21 would continue to thread all those acts into a coherent pattern. Their story was not built on the narrative of a single decisive battle, but on the slow, steady accumulation of resistance and support. It was a story of many small choices made in the correct order and of human bonds that made those choices possible. The squads did not seek recognition. They sought to protect, to make movement costly for an occupying force, and to keep the people of the land as free as circumstances allowed. When the sun set and long shadows pooled in river bends and along ridges, the squads moved quietly toward the next objective. They gathered what they needed, told each other what the day had taught them, and set tasks for those who would follow at dusk. They were neither myth nor legend, but a living organization of people who understood the work before them and who trusted each other to do it well. Across Upper Chin, Saugwing, Kachin, and the valleys of eastern Zalingam, the Kanabi squads continued to weave their presence into the landscape. Their story was not about individual glory, but about a collective effort, steady, careful, and relentlessly human. It was written not in proclamations, but in the small, repeated acts that let communities breathe, that allowed children to sleep at night, and that kept the possibility of life, ordinary, stubborn, and persistent, alive in a land that had learned to endure.